Criticisms and reforms of IMF and World Bank policies. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank are two of the most influential international financial institutions established to promote global economic stability and development. However, over the decades, both institutions have faced substantial criticisms regarding their policies, operations, and impacts on member countries, particularly developing nations. In response to these criticisms, both the IMF and the World Bank have undertaken various reforms aimed at improving their effectiveness, inclusivity, and responsiveness to the needs of their member states. This comprehensive analysis delves into the primary criticisms levied against the IMF and World Bank, followed by an exploration of the significant reforms they have implemented or proposed to address these issues. 1. Criticisms of IMF policies. Conditionality and economic sovereignty. One of the most persistent criticisms of the IMF revolves around the conditionality attached to its financial assistance programs. The IMF often requires borrowing countries to implement specific economic policies as a condition for receiving loans. These conditions typically include fiscal austerity measures, structural adjustments, deregulation, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and liberalization of trade and capital flows. Criticism. Erosion of national sovereignty. Critics argue that the stringent conditions imposed by the IMF undermine the economic sovereignty of borrowing nations. By dictating specific policy measures, the IMF is seen as interfering in the domestic affairs of sovereign states. One-size-fits-all approach. The IMF's conditionality has been criticized for adopting a uniform set of policies, regardless of the unique socioeconomic contexts of individual countries. This approach can lead to inappropriate or ineffective policy prescriptions that do not align with the specific needs or circumstances of the borrowing nation. Social impact. Austerity measures often involve cutting public spending, which can lead to reductions in essential services, such as healthcare, education, and social welfare. This can exacerbate poverty and inequality, leading to social unrest and political instability. 2. Structural Adjustment Programs (SAPs). Structural adjustment programs are comprehensive policy packages that the IMF and the World Bank have historically promoted to stabilize and restructure the economies of developing countries. Criticism. Economic hardship. SAPs have been associated with significant economic hardships for the populations of recipient countries. The implementation of fiscal austerity, removal of subsidies, and privatization of public services can lead to increased unemployment, higher prices for basic goods, and reduced access to essential services. Lack of focus on growth and development. Critics argue that SAPs prioritize macroeconomic stabilization over long-term growth and development. The emphasis on reducing fiscal deficits and controlling inflation may overlook the need for investments in infrastructure, education, and healthcare that are crucial for sustainable development. Weakening of public institutions. The push for privatization and deregulation can weaken public institutions and reduce the capacity of governments to effectively manage and regulate key sectors of the economy. 3. Inadequate representation and governance. The governance structures of the IMF and the World Bank have been criticized for being dominated by developed countries, particularly the United States and European nations. Criticism. Imbalance in voting power. The current quota system grants disproportionate voting power to wealthy nations, limiting the influence of emerging and developing economies. This imbalance can result in policies that reflect the interests of a few powerful countries, rather than the broader global community. Lack of inclusivity. The decision-making processes within these institutions have been criticized for lacking transparency and inclusivity. Developing countries often have limited opportunities to voice their concerns and influence policy formulations. Accountability issues. The perceived lack of accountability to the global population, particularly those in the most affected developing nations, undermines the legitimacy of the IMF and the World Bank. 4. Environmental and social concerns. Regarding the environmental and social impacts of its funded projects, criticism. Environmental degradation. Large infrastructure projects financed by the World Bank have sometimes led to environmental degradation, including deforestation, loss of biodiversity, and pollution. Critics argue that the institution has not done enough to ensure that projects adhere to environmental sustainability standards. Displacement of communities. Many World Bank-funded projects have resulted in the displacement of local communities without adequate compensation or resettlement plans. This has led to social disruption and loss of livelihoods for affected populations. Insufficient social safeguards. The safeguards intended to protect vulnerable populations have been criticized for being weak or inadequately enforced, leading to negative social outcomes. 5. Effectiveness and efficiency of programs. There is ongoing debate about the effectiveness and efficiency of the programs implemented by the IMF and the World Bank. Criticism. Mixed outcomes. While some countries have benefited from IMF and World Bank programs, others have experienced little to no improvement or have even worsened economically. The mixed outcomes raise questions about the overall effectiveness of the institution's approaches. Implementation challenges. The success of IMF and World Bank programs often depends on the effective implementation of recommended policies by national governments. However, political instability, corruption, and lack of institutional capacity in recipient countries can hinder the successful execution of these programs. Debt sustainability. Critics argue that the lending practices of the IMF and the World Bank can contribute to unsustainable debt levels in borrowing countries, trapping them in a cycle of debt dependency.